Are you tired of memorizing words in English only to forget them the very next day? Well, you're not alone, as this is a really common mistake that English learners like yourself make all the time. But what if I told you that you can actually remember English vocabulary words forever if you use the right methods? Today, I'll show you 10 simple strategies that worked for me when I had to learn a new language, and I am more than confident will also work for you too. In addition, I've helped many people with their English throughout the years, and I will soon be releasing a free crash course showing you in detail the fastest ways to become fluent in English by yourself from anywhere in the world. If you'd like to learn more about that, I will leave a link somewhere in the description or the pinned comment below. Now, the first method is to use the spaced repetition method. Now, the spaced repetition method works perfectly for retaining English vocabulary. Essentially, when your brain is naturally about to forget a word or an expression, the spaced repetition technique will ensure that the words that you are most likely to forget will be brought back to the forefront of your studying as you are going through this. Now, some of you might be wondering, how do you actually use the spaced repetition method in real life? The easiest way to use it is by using the application Anki. Now, I'm not paid to talk about this. This is a 100% free application that you can use that implements the spaced repetition technique flawlessly. Essentially, Anki is a flashcard application. And as you're studying your flashcards, you will identify which words or expressions you are more familiar with and which words and expressions you are less familiar with. Anki uses the spaced repetition technique because it tends to feed you the words that you are less comfortable with more frequently than the words that you are more comfortable with as you're studying your flashcard deck. This has been proven to work for language learners for very long periods of time, even before modern technology. So I highly recommend that you take advantage of an easy application to use like Anki. And a very important detail is to actually speak and say the words or expressions that you're using in your flashcard application out loud. If you read them in your head, you will never, ever learn how to actually physically speak English like an English speaker. This leads to the second method, which is to put words in context immediately. This works very well because the brain tends to remember stories and situations as opposed to isolated facts. So, whenever you come across a new word, always try to associate that word with a real experience or a real situation that you've actually felt throughout your life. For example, if you learn the word happy, try to associate it with a moment where you were actually very happy. For example, you were happy that you got a high score on your English test. Now you're going to associate the word happy with an emotion that you felt during a real experience that you had. The next method is to use the word that you learned in a real conversation. This works even for native English speakers like myself, because when you actually apply a new word that you learned to a real conversation, you're creating an experience to associate that word with. Now, you can do this pretty easily. Whenever you learn a new word, try to actually apply it on a real English speaker in a conversation. And if you don't think that you have access to native English speakers, they're actually very easy to find online just through language exchange applications. There are a bunch of free language exchange applications out there. The one that I used was called Hello Talk. But I'm sure there's many more where you can easily find a native English speaker to test your English out on. This leads to the next method, which is to link a word with imagery. Now, visual memory or emotional memory, as we mentioned earlier, is always going to be way more memorable than just translating a word back into your native language. If you are going to look up a new word on Google, for example, I would encourage you to look up the word on Google Images as opposed to looking up the word and then translating it back into your native language. Try to associate images with the words that you learn and try to associate situations with the expressions that you learn. Now, the next method is to create a memory palace. Now, this is kind of an old technique, but it has been proven to work. Essentially, when you learn a new word, you should try to associate that word with a particular location. So, for example, if the city that you come from is very hot, you can associate all of the words that relate to hot temperature to your home city. For example, if you come from the Middle East and it's very hot there during the summer, then you can associate the words hot, scorching, toasty, etc., all to that particular city. This works very well with adjectives, but it can also work for all of the other types of words and expressions as well. Now, this next method can do you wonders and make you an extremely fluent English speaker, and that is to use the word in multiple different contexts. This simply works because using the new word in different contexts builds a much more profound sense of memory. So, for example, when you learn a new word, let's just use the word excellent, try to use it in many different situations. This food was excellent. My phone reception is excellent. That person is an excellent person. Think about all of the different ways that you can actually use the new word that you learned and then actually apply it, whether that's through writing it, typing it, texting it, or even speaking it. Another method that is pretty important is to use word families. Now, this works well because related words reinforce one another. So, by learning one word, you can actually easily learn 10 other words that are all related to it. So, the next time you learn a new word, all you need to do is group it with all of the other forms of essentially the same word. An example of this would be the word create. It has many different forms, such as creation, creative, creativity, recreate, recreation. There are a lot of words like this in the English language. So by learning one, you can essentially apply all of the different variations to it as well, which is like learning 10 words by learning one word. This is a very efficient way to acquire English vocabulary. The eighth method is a very useful one, and that is teaching the new word that you learned to someone else. Now, this simply works because teaching forces you to fully understand something before you explain it to someone else. And generally speaking, if you can explain something simply, it probably means that you understand it very well. Now, it's pretty straightforward to do this. When you learn a new word, recall the context by which it was used, and then make a reference to the context that you learned the word in, and then explain it to the other person. If you don't have anyone else to explain it to, you can also try to explain it to yourself as if you were talking to another person. The ninth method is to track and recycle old words. Now, this is an easy way to retain long-term memory. And the way that you can do this is simply with that flashcard deck that we talked about earlier with the application Anki, which allows you to do this in a very efficient way. If you really want to, you can have multiple different flashcard decks on the application Anki. Some of them could be for old words that you don't use that often, and some of them could be for words that you do use very often. And this leads to the final tip, which is pretty easy as well, and that is to turn learning new words into a game. This works because games create dopamine, and if you have dopamine hits, it makes stuff more memorable in your brain. Now, there's a ton of applications and a ton of games online that are actually designed for vocabulary, so of course you can access them that way. If you don't want to use an application, Every time you come across a word that you do not understand, I would challenge you to try and guess what that word means based on the context that you see it in. But try to frame learning new words in more of a fun, loose, and non stressful way. Now, by applying these 10 simple strategies, retaining new English vocabulary will be a lot easier. If you have any questions at all about learning English, be sure to leave a comment and I'll be sure to answer your questions. Otherwise, leave a comment telling me where you're from and what your native language is. I would love to know. Learning vocabulary is the first step to learning any language fluently, but you will also need to learn how to think in English if you ever want to become a fluent speaker. I'll show you the easiest way to do this in the next video.